The drone of the lawnmower was a familiar soundtrack to Michael Thompson's Saturday mornings. From his home office window overlooking the meticulously kept St. Augustine grass of his own yard, he could see his neighbor Jim diligently tracing perfect stripes onto his. Willow Creek Estates prided itself on such things: the uniform green, the synchronized blooming of crepe myrtles, the quiet hum of shared aspiration. It was the American dream, neatly packaged, delivered with a homeowners association rulebook. Michael, a senior software engineer, had bought into it, built it, brick by digital brick in his career, and mortar by actual mortgage payment. He turned back to his monitor, lines of code blurring slightly. It wasn't the code that was the problem. It was a different kind of bug, one that had infiltrated the operating system of his life. Olivia. She'd been different lately. For months. It had started subtly, like a program running quietly in the background, consuming resources he hadn't noticed were dwindling. Her newfound passion was yoga. Serene Flow Yoga, a trendy studio that had opened near the new Whole Foods. At first, he'd been pleased. Olivia, a former graphic designer who'd transitioned to full-time motherhood after Maya, their 7-year-old, was born, had often lamented feeling adrift, her identity diluted by PTA meetings and endless carpool lines for Leo, their 10-year-old. "It's for me, Michael," she'd said, her eyes shining with an unfamiliar zeal, "to find my center, to reconnect with myself." He'd nodded, supportive. "Great, honey. Whatever makes you happy." Happy wife, happy life, wasn't that the cliche? He'd mentally filed it under positive spousal developments and returned to debugging a particularly thorny algorithm. But reconnecting with herself had rapidly morphed into something else. The single weekly class became 3, then 5. She bought new Lululemon outfits, sleek and expensive, in colors that made her look like an exotic bird. She spoke of Julian, the instructor, with a reverence usually reserved for spiritual gurus or particularly gifted celebrity chefs. Julian's wisdom on chakras, Julian's insights into pranayama, Julian's perfectly sculpted warrior pose. Michael, a man of logic and tangible results, found it all a bit much, but he'd kept his skepticism to himself. He wasn't adept at navigating the nuanced terrain of Olivia's emotional landscapes. He preferred the clear-cut topography of code and project deadlines. The distance, though, was no longer deniable. It wasn't just the time spent at the studio. It was the quiet evenings where she'd be engrossed in her phone, a small secretive smile playing on her lips as she texted. "Just yoga group chat," she'd say, a little too quickly. It was the way her vibrant energy, once a shared current in their home, now seemed reserved for something or someone outside it. She'd become a closed circuit, her light shining inward, or perhaps outward in a direction he couldn't see. The Texas summer was beginning to assert its humid dominance, the air thick and heavy even in the early mornings. It mirrored the atmosphere in their tastefully decorated suburban home. A suffocating stillness, pregnant with unspoken things. He'd tried in his fumbling way. "Everything okay, Liv? You seem distant." She'd waved a dismissive hand, her yoga-toned arm adorned with new silver bangles he didn't recognize. "Just tired, Michael. You know how it is. Kids, house, this yoga is intense." The previous Thursday had been the breaking point. He'd been looking for a receipt for a new sprinkler head in her purse. She was usually more organized with finances when his fingers brushed against a different kind of paper. Smaller, stiffer, a voucher. Tranquil Touch Spa, it read. Couples Bliss Massage, 90 minutes. And beneath that, in elegant script, for Julian V. and O. Thompson. Dated for the previous Tuesday afternoon, a time Olivia had claimed she was at an all-day advanced yoga workshop. The air conditioning in their bedroom suddenly felt frigid. Michael sank onto the edge of their king-sized bed, the voucher trembling in his hand. Julian V. The V likely stood for Vance, the surname he'd heard Olivia mention. O. Thompson. Olivia. His Olivia. A cold dread, sharp and visceral, pierced through his carefully constructed composure. It wasn't just yoga. It wasn't just finding herself. It was something concrete, something that had a name, a date, a spa. The carefully tended lawn outside, the quiet street, the framed family photos on the nightstand, it all felt like a meticulously crafted lie. His first instinct, the engineer's instinct, was to analyze, to gather more data. But beneath that, a primal hurt was awakening, a sense of betrayal so profound it left him breathless. He'd prided himself on their stability, their 15 years of shared history, the family they'd built. He'd thought their foundation was bedrock. Now, it felt like quicksand. For 2 days, he'd said nothing, the voucher hidden in his desk drawer like a toxic secret. He watched Olivia, her movements fluid and graceful from all that yoga, her face animated when she spoke of her day, a day he now suspected was a carefully curated fiction. The image of her with Julian at a spa, it was a corrosive acid eating away at his insides. Sleep became a battlefield. He'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it sliced through the humid night air, replaying memories, searching for clues he'd missed. Had he been a fool? Negligent? Too absorbed in his own world of deadlines and deliverables? The questions tormented him, offering no easy answers. Only a growing sense of shame and a simmering anger. Then, an idea, desperate and uncharacteristic, began to form. If she wouldn't tell him the truth, he would find it himself. He would go to Serene Flow Yoga. He would see them together in their element. He needed to witness it, to understand the allure, the dynamic. He needed to confront not just Olivia, but the reality of what was happening to his life. He imagined the scene, him standing there, an uninvited guest, the tangible evidence of their shared life, confronting her, confronting him. The thought was terrifying, exposing. But the alternative, this gnawing uncertainty, this silent erosion of everything he held dear, was unbearable. On Monday morning, after a restless weekend where every interaction with Olivia felt like navigating a minefield, Michael logged onto the Serene Flow Yoga website. Julian Vance's bio photo showed a man with sun-kissed skin, a mane of dark, artfully disheveled hair, and eyes that seemed to hold a universe of serene understanding. He was lean, sculpted, the epitome of the mindful, modern yogi. Michael, who considered a brisk walk with the dog his primary form of exercise, felt a sudden, sharp pang of inadequacy. He scrolled through the class schedule. Vinyasa flow with Julian, sunrise power hour with Julian, restorative yin with Julian. Julian. The man was a brand. He chose a Vinyasa flow class for Wednesday evening. Olivia always attended that one. The irony was a bitter pill. He, Michael Thompson, logical, pragmatic, slightly stiff-jointed Michael, was going to a yoga class to spy on his wife. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, a harsh, humorless sound in the quiet of his office. He felt a strange cocktail of dread, resolve, and a perverse curiosity. He was stepping off the well-trodden path of Willow Creek Estates and into uncharted, uncomfortable territory. He was going to catch her. What he didn't realize was that he was also walking into his own exposure. The antechamber of Serene Flow Yoga smelled of lavender and something vaguely citrusy. It was all pale wood, strategically placed succulents, and soft ambient music that sounded like whale song mixed with wind chimes. Women, mostly, and a few men, all looking remarkably limber and serene, milled about in expensive activewear, sipping from eco-friendly water bottles. Michael, in his slightly too big gym shorts and an old band t-shirt, felt like an elephant in a flock of gazelles. He'd told Olivia he was working late, a common enough occurrence. The lie had felt clumsy on his tongue, but she'd accepted it without question, already halfway out the door, yoga mat tucked under her arm. "Don't wait up," she'd called, a breezy, almost cheerful farewell. He checked in at the front desk, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the hushed space. The young woman with a septum-piercing and unnervingly calm eyes handed him a rental mat. "Enjoy your flow," she said, her voice a soft lull. The studio itself was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a bamboo garden. Soft light filtered in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. About 20 mats were already laid out. He scanned the room, heart hammering against his ribs. And there she was, Olivia. Near the front, naturally. She was chatting animatedly with a woman beside her, her face alive, radiant. She looked happy. A different kind of happy than he'd seen in a long time. A happiness that didn't include him. Then Julian Vance entered. He moved with an almost liquid grace, his presence instantly commanding the room. He was exactly as his photo depicted, perhaps even more so in person. Charismatic, with an easy smile that seemed to embrace everyone individually. He wore loose linen pants and a simple tank top that showcased impressively defined arms. Michael felt a fresh wave of something ugly and unfamiliar. Jealousy, perhaps, or simple, unadulterated resentment. "Welcome, beautiful souls," Julian began, his voice a rich baritone that filled the room without effort. "Let's find our breath, find our center." Michael unrolled his mat in the far back corner, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. He could see Olivia clearly. She was looking at Julian with an expression of rapt attention, almost adoration. It was the look she used to give Michael, years ago, when he'd explain some complex scientific concept or fix a seemingly unfixable household appliance. The class began. Michael, who hadn't touched his toes willingly since high school gym class, found himself contorting his body into positions that felt both unnatural and vaguely humiliating. Downward-facing dog felt more like downward-facing disaster. His hamstrings screamed in protest. His breath, which Julian kept urging them to deepen and connect with, came in ragged, shallow gasps. He tried to focus on Olivia and Julian. Julian moved through the room, offering gentle adjustments, his touch light but firm. When he paused by Olivia, lingering perhaps a fraction of a second longer than necessary, offering a soft word that made her smile, Michael felt a hot flush of anger. He saw Julian's hand brush her lower back as he corrected her posture in a warrior pose. It was subtle, professional even. But to Michael's hyper-aware senses, it screamed intimacy. The class was a blur of unfamiliar Sanskrit terms, aching muscles, and the constant, torturous awareness of Olivia's apparent devotion to this yoga god. He stumbled through poses, his frustration mounting. He wasn't just out of his element, he was drowning in it. This wasn't the controlled confrontation he'd envisioned. This was a public display of his own inadequacy, his own displacement. Towards the end, during Savasana, the final resting pose, they lay on their backs, eyes closed. Julian's voice, soft and hypnotic, guided them through a meditation. Let go of what no longer serves you. Release tension. Find your inner peace. Michael lay there, rigid, anything but peaceful. What no longer served him? The question echoed in the cavern of his mind. Was it his marriage, his carefully constructed life, his illusions? As Julian's voice faded into silence, a strange thing happened. In the enforced stillness, with the scent of lavender filling his nostrils and the unfamiliar ache in his limbs, a different kind of tension began to release. Not the physical kind, but an emotional one. A profound wave of sadness washed over him, so potent it almost brought tears to his eyes. It wasn't just about Olivia and Julian. It was about him. About the years of emotional reticence, the unspoken needs, the gradual drift he'd been too busy or too afraid to acknowledge. He felt a hollowness within himself, a space he'd tried to fill with work, with routine, with the illusion of control. The exposure he'd sought for Olivia was turning inward, shining an unwelcome spotlight on his own neglected emotional landscape. He felt raw, vulnerable, stripped bare in a room full of strangers. When the class ended, Olivia, gathering her things, finally spotted him. Her eyes widened, first in disbelief, then a flicker of panic, quickly masked by a carefully constructed neutrality that hardened into annoyance. Michael, what on earth are you doing here? Her voice was a low hiss, drawing a few curious glances. He stood up, his legs shaky, his t-shirt clinging unpleasantly to his back. I could ask you the same thing, he managed, his voice hoarse. The witty, accusatory lines he'd rehearsed evaporated. He just felt tired and exposed. Julian approached them, his serene smile firmly in place. Michael, is it? Welcome to Serene Flow. Olivia, you didn't tell me your husband was joining us. There was a subtle challenge in his tone, a proprietary air that made Michael's fists clench. Olivia shot Julian a tight, warning look, then turned back to Michael. We need to talk. At home. The drive back to Willow Creek Estates was a symphony of oppressive silence. The Texas night, usually alive with the thrum of cicadas, felt muted, holding its breath. Michael gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Olivia stared out her window, her profile etched in the passing streetlights, unreadable. Once inside their kitchen, the carefully curated heart of their home, the dam of her composure broke. How could you, Michael? She demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Spying on me? Humiliating me like that? Humiliating you? Michael's own anger, a slow burn throughout the yoga class, finally ignited. What about me, Olivia? What about the couple's massage voucher for you and Julian? What about the lies? The secrecy? He pulled the voucher from his pocket, the paper crinkling in his fist, and threw it on the granite countertop. It landed with a soft, damning thud. Olivia stared at the voucher, her face paling. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a weary resignation. She sank onto a kitchen stool, her Lululemon-clad shoulders slumping. It's not It's not what you think, she began, but her voice lacked conviction. Then what is it, Olivia? Michael's voice was raw, laced with a pain that surprised even him. Tell me, because I've been living in a fog for months. I need to understand. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. I was lost, Michael. I am lost. You're always working, always logical. I felt invisible. Julian, he sees me. He makes me feel alive. Alive. The word felt like a betrayal in itself. And what about our life, Olivia? What about Leo and Maya? What about 15 years? The argument raged, not in shouts, but in bitter, whispered accusations and tearful confessions. Olivia admitted to an emotional affair, to a deep connection with Julian that had, yes, recently crossed a line into the physical. Not the lurid, passionate affair Michael's pained imagination had conjured, but a series of clandestine meetings, stolen moments, the massage. She spoke of feeling like a ghost in her own life, of yearning for something more than PTA bake sales and carpool logistics. She painted a picture of a woman starved for attention, for passion, for a sense of self she felt had been eroded by the mundane realities of suburban motherhood, and a husband who, in her eyes, had become complacent and emotionally distant. Michael listened, each word a fresh wound. He heard her pain, her loneliness, but it was filtered through the deafening roar of his own betrayal. He also heard, with a sickening lurch, a kernel of truth in her accusations about his own emotional unavailability. Had he been so focused on providing, on maintaining the structure of their lives, that he'd forgotten to nurture the heart of it? The climax wasn't a screaming match. It was a moment of stark, brutal honesty in the sterile glow of their designer kitchen. Olivia, weeping, confessed the extent of her involvement with Julian. Michael, in turn, didn't just express his hurt and anger, but also a dawning, terrifying awareness of his own emotional shortcomings, a vulnerability that had been cracked open in that bizarre, humiliating yoga class. I don't know who I am anymore, Michael, Olivia whispered, her face buried in her hands. And I don't think I know who you are either. Neither do I, Liv, he said, the fight leaving him, replaced by an aching emptiness. Neither do I. The exposure was complete. Her affair was out. His inner world, his carefully guarded emotions, had been breached, not by her, but by himself, in that unexpected crucible of serene flow yoga. The foundation of Willow Creek Estates had crumbled beneath their feet. The days that followed were a desolate landscape of unspoken grief and fractured routines. Olivia moved into the guest room. The silence in the house was a heavy blanket, muffling even the children's laughter, which now seemed strained, tinged with an awareness that something was terribly wrong. Michael and Olivia communicated in terse, functional exchanges, mostly about Leo and Maya, navigating their carefully constructed co-parenting truce like strangers. Michael told his friend and colleague, David Chen, over a somber lunch at a Tex-Mex place that usually echoed with their easy banter. David, ever the pragmatist, but with a surprising emotional depth, listened without judgment. Man, that's rough, David said, shaking his head. Seriously rough. What are you going to do? I don't know, Michael admitted, pushing his untouched enchiladas around his plate. Part of me wants to burn everything to the ground. Another part, I don't even know what that part wants. Have you thought about therapy? David asked gently. Both of you? Or even just for yourself? Michael flinched. Therapy. It felt like an admission of failure, another crack in the facade of his competence. But the rawness he felt, the confusion, was overwhelming. Maybe, he conceded. The most surprising thing was that Michael continued to go to yoga, not to Julian's classes. The thought of seeing him, of seeing Olivia fawning over him, was still too galling. He found a different class, at a different time, with a different instructor. A kind, older woman named Anya, whose focus was more on gentle movement and self-acceptance than pretzel-like contortions and spiritual pronouncements. He went, initially, out of a strange compulsion, a need to revisit the place of his undoing. But then, something shifted. In the quiet rhythm of breath and movement, in the focus required to hold a pose, he found a strange solace. The physical exertion tired him out in a way that his sedentary job never did. And in that exhaustion, his racing mind sometimes found a moment of quiet. He was still clumsy, still the least flexible person in the room, but he no longer felt the sting of humiliation. He was there for himself, in a way he'd never been before. The studio, once a symbol of betrayal, was slowly, inexplicably, becoming a space for his own tentative healing. He noticed the small things, the way his back felt a little less stiff after class, the way his breath deepened, not just on the mat, but in moments of stress at work. He started to understand, intellectually at first, then emotionally, the connection between body and mind that Julian had so glibly espoused. It wasn't about finding his center in some mystical sense, but about finding a connection to himself, to the physical reality of his own being, which he had long neglected. Olivia, meanwhile, seemed adrift. The illicit thrill of her affair, Michael suspected, had lost its luster once exposed to the harsh light of reality. He saw her on the periphery of his life, at school pickups, during strained family dinners for the children's sake. She looked tired, her vibrant glow diminished. He heard, through the grapevine of neighborhood gossip that inevitably reached even his insulated ears, that Julian Vance had a reputation for such connections with his students. He was a serial charmer, leaving a trail of briefly seen women in his wake. The thought brought Michael a grim, hollow satisfaction, but it didn't lessen his own pain. He took David's advice and found a therapist, Dr. Eleanor Vance. No relation, he'd checked with a grim irony. She was a calm, insightful woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a direct but gentle manner. In her quiet, tastefully decorated office, so different from the forced serenity of the yoga studio, Michael began to unpack the tangled mess of his emotions. He talked about the betrayal, the anger, the profound sense of loss. He talked about his marriage, his role in its slow erosion, his fear of vulnerability, his ingrained habit of suppressing his feelings. Dr. Vance listened, nodding, asking questions that gently prodded him deeper. "It sounds like you're grieving, Michael," she said one afternoon, after he described the hollowness he felt. "Not just the marriage you thought you had, but perhaps an idea of yourself, too." He considered that. It was true. The Michael Thompson, who had prided himself on logic, control, and stability, had been shattered. The man emerging was uncertain, bruised, but also, strangely, a little more real. "This yoga thing," he told her, feeling a bit sheepish. "It's strange. I went there to catch her, to expose her, and I ended up, I don't know, exposing myself to myself." Dr. Vance smiled faintly. "Sometimes the universe has a peculiar way of delivering its lessons. What have you learned from this? Self-exposure?" He thought about the physical sensations of yoga, the ache, the stretch, the effort. "That I'm not as strong as I thought," he said. "Physically, I mean, but also that it's okay to be uncomfortable. That growth happens in the discomfort." He paused. "And that I've spent a lot of years ignoring what my own body, my own feelings were trying to tell me." Olivia, too, started therapy with a different counselor. They began attending couples counseling at Dr. Vance's guarded suggestion, though Michael held little hope for reconciliation. The sessions were fraught, painful, like picking at a barely healed wound. Olivia expressed remorse, a confused mix of guilt and a lingering resentment for the years she'd felt unseen. Michael spoke of the broken trust, a chasm that felt too wide to bridge. There were moments of raw honesty, of shared sorrow for what they had lost, for the pain they had caused each other, inadvertently, their children. Leo was quieter, more withdrawn. Maya asked difficult questions. "Why is Mommy sleeping in the guest room? Are you and Mommy mad at each other forever?" Those questions were like daggers to Michael's heart. He didn't know if their marriage could be rebuilt. The image of Olivia with Julian, the lies, the betrayal, they were deeply embedded. But he was learning that he couldn't control the outcome. All he could control was his own response, his own journey. Summer bled into a Texas fall, the oppressive humidity finally yielding to cooler, crisper air. The leaves on the trees in Willow Creek Estates began to turn shades of red and gold, a visual metaphor for the changes in his own life. Michael still went to yoga 3 times a week now. He'd even bought his own mat, a sturdy, no-nonsense black one. He could almost touch his toes. He could hold a plank for a full minute. These were small victories, but they mattered. He'd occasionally see Julian in the hallways of Serene Flow between classes. Julian would nod, his serene smile unwavering, as if Michael were just another student, as if he hadn't played a pivotal role in dismantling Michael's life. Michael would just look through him, a flicker of the old anger still there, but mostly a strange kind of detachment. Julian was a catalyst, a symbol, but the real work, the real issues, lay within Michael, within Olivia, within the fractured space of their marriage. One Saturday morning, instead of the drone of lawnmowers, Michael heard the gentle thud of a yoga mat unrolling in the living room. He walked out of his home office to see Olivia, not in her sleek Lululemon, but in old sweatpants and one of his oversized t-shirts, tentatively moving through a sun salutation. She looked awkward, hesitant, a stark contrast to the confident yogini he'd seen in Julian's class. She saw him watching, and for a moment, her face flushed. She stopped midway through a pose. "What?" she asked, a defensive edge to her voice. "Nothing," Michael said. He didn't feel anger or suspicion. He felt a flicker of something unreadable. "Just didn't expect to see you doing yoga here." "My therapist suggested it," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Just to connect with myself, or whatever." There was a hint of her old sarcasm, but it was tinged with a new vulnerability. He nodded slowly. He understood that need now, in a way he never could have before. The resolution wasn't a Hollywood ending. There was no magical reconciliation, no sudden erasing of the pain. Olivia eventually moved into a small apartment nearby, and they began the difficult, painful process of legal separation, prioritizing civility for the sake of Leo and Maya. The house in Willow Creek Estates, once a symbol of their shared dream, felt too large, too haunted by ghosts of what used to be. Michael was considering selling it. The lessons learned were hard-won, etched into his psyche through sleepless nights, therapy sessions, and countless downward-facing dogs. He learned that betrayal, while devastating, could also be a brutal but effective teacher. It had stripped him of his complacency, forced him to confront his own emotional illiteracy. He learned that true strength wasn't about stoic control, but about the courage to be vulnerable, to feel, to admit weakness. He learned that sometimes, in the desperate attempt to find out what was wrong with someone else, you stumbled upon the uncomfortable truths about yourself. His quest to expose Olivia's affair had, in a profound and unexpected way, exposed him to his own pain, his own neglect, his own capacity for growth. The final scene of this chapter of his life wasn't in a courtroom or a therapist's office. It was on his yoga mat, in Anya's gentle Saturday morning class. The studio was filled with the soft sounds of breathing, the scent of sandalwood incense. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the room with a warm, clear light. Michael moved through the familiar sequence of poses, his body stronger, more flexible than he could have ever imagined a year ago. He wasn't the most graceful, not by a long shot, but he was present. He felt the stretch in his hamstrings, the strength in his core, the steady rhythm of his breath. During Savasana, as he lay on his back, eyes closed, Anya's voice washed over him, calm and soothing. "Allow yourself to be here, just as you are. No judgment, just acceptance." And for the first time in a very long time, Michael Thompson felt a sense of peace. Not the manufactured serenity of Serene Flow Yoga's marketing, nor the brittle illusion of control he'd once clung to. It was a quieter, deeper peace. The kind that comes from having walked through fire and emerged, scarred, yes, but also tempered, more whole. He was no longer defined solely by the betrayal, by the title of wronged husband. He was Michael, a father, a man still learning, still healing, a man who had, in the most unlikely of places, begun to find himself, not because he was looking, but because he'd been forced to stop running from the uncomfortable truths within. The manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates still existed, but his world was no longer confined to their perfect, deceptive borders. He was learning to cultivate his own inner landscape, one that was messier, more complex, but infinitely more real. And in that, however small, there was hope.